There is a spice that Roman generals sprinkled on marriage beds to attract good fortune, that Buddhist monks used for centuries to dye their robes that yellow we now associate with spiritual awakening, that the Arabs carried to the ends of the known world, and that the Germans of the late Middle Ages punished with the stake for counterfeiting, and that today, in the laboratory basements of 3 continents, is showing an ability to slow down Alzheimer's that no drug developed in the last 40 years has managed to match. That spice is saffron, and its story is not a story of spices. It is a story of power, of roots that crossed deserts and seas, of silent wars between unscrupulous merchants, of nuns who knew more medicine than the doctors of their time, of a country, Spain, that keeps in La Mancha the only saffron with a designation of origin recognized as the most valuable in the world, and of a science that has spent 2 decades discovering, with the most sophisticated apparatus that exists, exactly what Persia, Greece, the Caliphate of Cordoba, and the convents of New Spain in the 17th century already knew without the need for microscopes. But before we talk about laboratories, we need to talk about a wall that has stood for 3,500 years on a Greek island. In Akrotiri, on the island of Santorini, beneath meters of volcanic ash deposited by the eruption of Mount Thera around 1500 BCE, archaeologists found something that brought their work to a complete halt. Inside a house that the inhabitants of that Minoan city had abandoned before the cataclysm, the walls preserved frescoes that are now on display at the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. One of these frescoes depicts, with a botanical precision that astonishes anyone who observes it closely, a young woman gathering violet flowers with bright red stamens. She is crouching among the plants, and the basket she carries contains, beyond any doubt for the botanists who have studied them, flowers of Crocus sativus. Saffron. 3,500 years. Knowledge of this plant didn't begin in the Middle Ages. It didn't begin with the Arabs. It didn't begin with the Persians, although they were perhaps its most fervent devotees. Humankind's relationship with saffron is lost in that realm where history becomes archaeology, and archaeology begins to resemble myth. The Persians of the Achaemenid era, those who built Persepolis and whose king Darius sent 100,000 soldiers against the Greeks at Marathon, held saffron in a category unlike any other spice. At the court of Persepolis, the stamens of this flower were mixed with wax and rosewater to create the ointments applied to the bodies of kings. The robes of Zoroastrian high priests were inlaid with its pigment, that orange yellow that Persian poets likened to the setting sun over the desert. At royal banquets, saffron was not just another ingredient, it was proof that the host had access to something most of humanity would never taste in their entire lives. Why exactly that price was so exorbitant, we'll understand better in a moment. But first, let's follow the geographical trail of this plant, because its spread around the world is one of the most fascinating routes in the history of ancient trade. From Persia, it reached India, where the oldest known Sanskrit texts already mention it as kumkuma, and where the Kama Sutra, that manual many believe deals only with positions but is actually a treatise on the art of living, recommends it as a perfume and as an element of exquisite hospitality. From India, it reached the shores of the Middle East via the Arabian Sea. From there, it traveled with the Phoenicians to the shores of the Western Mediterranean. The Greeks incorporated it into their religious rituals. In the Homeric hymns, there are references to saffron as the flower that Aphrodite scattered on her path, and the Spartans used it to perfume their bathwater. Alexander the Great, according to several classical chroniclers, added it to his bathwater during military campaigns, a mixture of vanity, primitive hygiene, and perhaps something his court physician had prescribed for the wounds he accumulated in each battle. The Romans took this Greek knowledge and multiplied it across the scale of the empire. Latin writers of the imperial period, from Pliny the Elder to Columella and Catullus, mention saffron with a frequency that surprises any modern reader. Pliny, in his monumental Natural History, written around 77 AD, devotes several paragraphs to describing its medicinal properties, particularly its ability to calm the mind, relieve headaches, and improve sleep. Columella, the Roman agronomist born in Cadiz, whose work on agriculture is one of the most important documents left to us by classical Rome, describes in technical detail how to cultivate Crocus sativus in the Roman gardens of Hispania, that is, in what is now Spain, and mentions that even in his time, around the 1st century AD, there were plots dedicated to its cultivation in the region we now call Andalusia. The Romans, in addition to their perfumed baths and medicinal readings, had a custom that no modern botanist has been able to fully explain. At patrician weddings, the bridal beds were covered with saffron petals and stigmas. The official reason was that it attracted luck and fertility. But some researchers today, knowing what we know about the active compounds of this plant, wonder if those Romans weren't doing something more pragmatic than it seems. We'll come back to that. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, saffron did not disappear from Europe. But it did become confined to monasteries, which for centuries were the only repositories of botanical and medical knowledge on the continent. Benedictine monks in northern Italy and southern France cultivated Crocus sativus in their cloistered gardens with a precision that was, in its own way, both spiritual and scientific. In Apuleius's Herbarium, a medical text that circulated widely in medieval scriptoria and that preserved some of Dioscorides' knowledge, saffron appears as a remedy for bowel ailments, liver afflictions, and states of melancholy and sadness of spirit, which is how medieval medicine described what we would now call depression. And then the Arabs arrived, not as invaders who destroyed knowledge, but as heirs who multiplied it, and as transmitters who saved knowledge that would otherwise have burned in the bonfires of the desolation of the late antique world. Ibn Sina, whom Europe would come to know as Avicenna, dedicated entire pages to saffron in his Canon of Medicine, written between 980 and 1037 CE, which was used as the official text in European medical schools for more than 600 years. Avicenna described saffron as a heart strengthener, a mood stabilizer, and a stimulant of brain function. Ibn al-Battar, the Andalusian botanist born in Malaga in the 12th century, whose work, the Kitab al-Jami, which is the most complete compilation of medicinal plants of the Middle Ages, was the most cited botanical reference in the Arab world for 3 centuries, included saffron among the spices of the first therapeutic category, and described with remarkable detail the differences in quality between Persian saffron, that cultivated in the region of Syria, and that which was already being produced in his time in Al-Andalus, in the fields that today we would recognize as part of La Mancha and the Sierra de Cuenca. Because that's what the Arabs brought to the Iberian Peninsula, not just saffron, but the technology to cultivate it on a large scale. And they planted it in the heart of Castile. Imagine a field in La Mancha at the end of October. The soil is dry and chalky, like parched skin under the Castilian sun, which in summer scorches everything not buried. But during those autumn weeks, when temperatures plummet and the light turns horizontal and reddish in the mid-afternoon, something extraordinary happens. The Crocus sativus, which has spent the warmer months dormant underground in the form of a corm, a kind of modified bulb, breaks through the Earth's crust and opens its purple petals in an explosion that lasts barely 2 or 3 weeks in total. Each flower lives for exactly 1 day. If you don't pick it before the sun rises, the petals wither and the stigmas, that red thread I mentioned, that filament that is the valuable part, become useless. That's why the saffron harvest is what it is, a race against dawn. Families in La Mancha who still cultivate saffron in the traditional way get up before sunrise in October or November, go out into the fields with baskets, and pick each flower by hand, one by one, before the daylight fully opens them and the dew damages them. It's a silent, collective task that for centuries was the work of women and children, while the men attended to the other farm chores. Then comes the peeling, separating by hand, with their fingers, the 3 stigmas of each flower from the rest of the plant. 3 stigmas per flower. To obtain 1 kilogram of dry, clean saffron, you need to pick and peel between 150,000 and 200,000 flowers. 200,000 flowers by hand, one by one, in 2 or 3 weeks of harvesting before the sun ruins them. That explains the price. It's not a market whim. It's pure arithmetic. During the Andalusian period, spanning from the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century to the fall of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada in 1492. Arab culture transformed the fields of La Mancha, the Alqueria, and parts of Aragon into an organized saffron-growing region that supplied markets stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the ports of northern Europe. Caravans departing from Toledo and Cuenca for the ports of the Levant carried sacks of saffron along with merino wool and tanned leather, destined for Genoa, Venice, Alexandria, and Constantinople. By the 12th century, Spanish saffron already enjoyed a reputation for superior quality to Persian and Greek saffron, a reputation that, 7 centuries later, is protected by the La Mancha Saffron Protected Designation of Origin, PDO. But La Mancha was not the only Spanish-speaking territory that experienced saffron in its full splendor. In the convents of New Spain during the 17th century, the Hieronymite and Poor Clare nuns, who had inherited both the Spanish apothecary tradition and the herbal knowledge of the indigenous Mexica healers, attempted, with varying degrees of success, to adapt saffron cultivation to the Mexican highlands. It did not thrive everywhere. The climate of central Mexico does not produce the nighttime frosts that Crocus sativus needs to break its dormancy, but in the highlands of Puebla and what is now the state of Mexico, small convent farms existed for decades, supplying the convent pharmacy and, from there, the leading families of the vice-regal city. The apothecary nuns of Puebla, those women of whom Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was the most visible and brilliant tip of an iceberg of suppressed female erudition, used saffron in their preparations for vapors of the spirit, the term used in Galenic medicine for what we would now call depressive and anxious states. They mixed it with cinnamon, allspice, and certain compounds of indigenous origin whose exact identity, in many cases, was never recorded in writing, because the oral traditions of the indigenous healers who collaborated with these women faded away in the silence of 3 centuries of colonization. In Europe, meanwhile, saffron was experiencing its period of greatest prestige and greatest danger. I mean dangerous in the literal sense. In the city of Nuremberg, in the heart of what was then the Holy Roman Empire, the guild authorities had established, at the end of the 14th century, an institution without parallel in European history. The Saffron Show, its name in Old High German means, more or less, saffron inspection, and it was the most ruthless commercial tribunal that ever existed to regulate a single spice. Its inspectors had the power to confiscate entire shipments suspected of adulteration, to fine established merchants, and, in serious cases, to impose the death penalty. This is not a metaphor. In 1444, the merchant Jobst Findecker was burned alive in Nuremberg along with his adulterated shipment of saffron. 2 other documented cases of execution for saffron adulteration occurred between that year and 1500, and at least a dozen traders ended up buried alive next to their counterfeit product, which was the saffron shoe's second penalty for repeat offenders. Why this level of institutional violence against a species? Because genuine, high-quality saffron was worth more than gold per unit of weight in 14th century European markets. Literally, in some market records from the late Middle Ages preserved in the archives of Venice and Genoa, top-quality saffron is listed at a price higher than that of fine gold. And where so much money was at stake, the temptation to mix the product with dyed poppy petals, red safflower strands, mineral-colored plant fibers, or damp earth to increase its weight was irresistible to the less scrupulous merchants. The result was a product that could cause poisoning, was medically ineffective, and destroyed trust throughout the entire supply chain. The Saffronschau was the Germanic response to this problem. Absolute control, radical transparency, and the maximum penalty for fraud. The Vikings, who roamed the trade routes of northern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean long before any history book mentioned them as warriors with horns on their helmets, a detail, incidentally, entirely fabricated, had saffron high on their list of most valuable items in their raids and trading expeditions. Archaeological excavations at 9th and 10th century Viking settlements in Scandinavia have uncovered traces of saffron pigments and records of trade with Arab merchants from the Abbasid Caliphate. When a group of Norse warriors attacked a monastery in northern France or on the coast of Ireland, the first thing they looked for after the gold and silver in the sacristies was the apothecary brothers' cupboard. And in that cupboard, invariably, there was saffron. This isn't medieval poetry, it's market archaeology. Meanwhile, on the Iberian Peninsula, Andalusian saffron continued its life parallel to politics. When the Catholic monarchs completed the Reconquista and Granada fell in 1492, the same year Columbus reached the Americas, a historical coincidence that still makes one's head turn when one thinks about it seriously. The Moorish saffron growers who had sustained the Castilian fields for centuries suddenly found themselves in a position of enormous vulnerability. The expulsion of the Moriscos, which began in 1609 under Philip III and, within 5 years, forced approximately 300,000 people to leave the peninsula, including a significant portion of the most skilled farmers and artisans of Castile and Valencia, left a technical void in the cultivation of many complex products, a void that took Spanish agriculture decades to fill. But La Mancha saffron survived. It was saved by the old Castilian families who had learned cultivation techniques from their Moorish neighbors over generations of coexistence. It was also saved by the nobles and bishops who owned the land because no feudal lord was going to willingly relinquish a source of income that yielded returns per kilogram comparable to any other crop. La Mancha saffron weathered the 17th century with its plagues, famines, and demographic catastrophe, and reached the 18th century as one of the Spanish crown's most valuable exports. Andrés Laguna, the Segovian physician who translated Dioscorides' work into Spanish and published it in Antwerp in 1555 under the title Pedanius Dioscorides of Anazarbus, on medicinal matter and deadly poisons, included in this fundamental work a section on saffron that reveals what European medicine of the 16th century knew, and what it intuited but could not prove. Laguna described saffron as a first-rate remedy for melancholy, stomach ailments, and what he called the passions of the heart, which in the language of the time encompassed both what we would now call anxiety and what we would call depression. And he added a warning that any modern toxicologist would recognize as scientifically correct, that excessive doses of saffron produce a state of uncontrollable laughter and excitement followed by collapse, which is exactly the clinical description of an overdose of crocin, the active pigment in saffron, at sufficiently high doses. Dioscorides, 4 centuries before Laguna, had said something similar in his Materia Medica. The knowledge was ancient. What was lacking was the instrument to explain it at the molecular level. During the heyday of the European saffron trade, between the 14th and 16th centuries, entire trade routes existed whose sole purpose was to move this spice from the fields of production to the consumer markets. The saffron route, connecting La Mancha with the Mediterranean ports of Valencia and Cartagena, was so economically important to medieval Castile that it appears in tax documents from the House of Trade in Seville as one of the most regular and heavily taxed sources of revenue for the crown. Saffron from La Mancha was shipped to Italy, where it was used in the university medical schools of Bologna and Padua, the 2 great medical schools of medieval Europe, to the markets of Northern Europe, to the Ottoman Empire, and, via Venetian and Genoese merchants, to Persia and India, which was a bit like selling coal to Newcastle, but at prices that made the absurdity profitable. The Royal Pharmacy of El Escorial, founded by Philip II in the monumental complex that still stands today in the mountains near Madrid, was one of the most advanced pharmacological laboratories in Europe during the 16th century. Its herbalists cultivated a collection of medicinal plants in the monastery gardens, using the most up-to-date botanical treatises of the time. This collection included saffron among the most prized. The physician Juan de Herrera, who oversaw the construction of El Escorial, and Philip II's own chief apothecary, Luis de Oviedo, corresponded with the botanists of Francisco Hernández de Toledo's expedition, the first scientific expedition to the New World, undertaken between 1571 and 1577, exchanging observations on medicinal plants and comparing the properties of European saffron with compounds of similar structure found in the herbs of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. There was no chemistry laboratory to test anything, but there was systematic observation, written records, and a community of practice that, within the limitations of the knowledge of the time, was as rigorous as it could be. And then the decline began. It wasn't quick, It wasn't a single event. It was the accumulation of several pressures that, in the space of a little over a century, transformed saffron from a medical and culinary necessity into a marginal luxury item that most people buy in small gift-wrapped paper boxes to add to rice on special occasions. The first pressure came from 19th century chemistry. The development of aniline and synthetic dyes, beginning with the work of William Henry Perkin in 1856 and the subsequent industrial development, meant that dyeing fabrics yellow or orange, one of saffron's most important historical uses, suddenly cost a fraction of what it had for millennia. The textile industry, which had been one of the largest consumers of saffron for centuries, suddenly found itself without it. The second pressure came from medicine. The 19th and 20th centuries saw the birth of modern pharmacology, a discipline that identified specific active ingredients, isolated them, synthesized them in the laboratory, and patented them. A plant that could not be patented, that grew freely in the fields of La Mancha, and that any family with a small plot of land could cultivate, held no commercial interest for the new pharmaceutical industry. The market for drugs for melancholy, which throughout the 20th century was clinically redefined as depression, anxiety, and seasonal affective disorder, that enormous and lucrative market was captured by synthetic compounds. First barbiturates, then benzodiazepine anxiolytics, then tricyclic antidepressants. Finally, at the end of the 20th century, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, the best-known example of which is fluoxetine, marketed under the name Prozac since 1987. The mood-altering drug market was worth over $20 billion annually worldwide in 2020. It was a market where each patented active ingredient generated billions in revenue for years. No one in that market had the slightest incentive to investigate whether a flower growing in a field in La Mancha could do the same thing as fluoxetine. The third pressure was demographic and economic. Saffron cultivation is incompatible with mechanization. There is no machine that can harvest the flowers before they open and separate the stigmas without destroying them. It is manual labor, requiring early mornings and bending over the furrows in the October cold. In the 20th century, when Spain's rural economies suffered from industrialization and the exodus to the cities, when agricultural wages rose and labor in the fields became scarce, the cultivation of saffron in La Mancha collapsed. In 1970, Spain produced nearly 50 tons of saffron annually. By 2020, that figure had fallen to less than 2 tons, a drop of more than 96% in 50 years. What was on the market in the meantime? Iranian saffron, Indian saffron, Azerbaijani saffron. Products that arrived at much lower prices, partly because labor costs were lower in those countries, partly because some of those products were adulterated in more sophisticated ways than the Nuremberg saffron shoe had pursued in the 15th century, and which gradually displaced La Mancha saffron in the mass markets, relegating it to the haute cuisine segment and the collector's designation of origin. And so, without anyone decreeing it, without any law prohibiting it, without any court condemning it, one of the most documented medical knowledges in the history of humanity was buried under 3 layers of simultaneous oblivion. The oblivion of the fields, which no one cultivated anymore, the oblivion of the pharmacy, which no one visited because there was a family doctor who gave you a prescription in 10 minutes, and the oblivion of science, which had no incentive to investigate what it could not patent. 3 centuries of convent knowledge. 2,000 years of Arab, Greek, and Persian medicine. 3,500 years since that Minoan woman painted on the wall of Akrotiri bent her back over those violet flowers. All of that stored in a field in La Mancha that, in many provinces, stopped being sown. Researchers who began searching scientific databases for publications on Crocus sativus in 2001 found something disturbing. There were hundreds of references to its medicinal use in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and medieval European texts, and barely a handful of modern studies with rigorous methodology. A handful. For a plant documented for 3.5 millennia as a therapeutic agent in 4 great civilizations. That void wasn't accidental. It was the exact result of the economic pressures you already know about. But in that same year, 2001, A team of researchers from the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Tabriz in northwestern Iran, a city less than 200 kilometers from the fields where Persian saffron has been cultivated continuously for at least 2,500 years, published a study in the journal Phytomedicine that is now considered the starting point for modern clinical research on this plant. The study was simple in its design. 40 patients diagnosed with mild to moderate major depression were divided into two groups, one treated with saffron petal extract and the other with a placebo, for 6 weeks. The results showed that the group treated with saffron exhibited a statistically significant improvement on depression assessment scales compared to the placebo group. It was the first controlled clinical trial of saffron for depression published in a peer-reviewed journal. A year later, the same Tabriz group published a second study, this time directly comparing saffron extract with imipramine, a tricyclic antidepressant that has been used in clinical psychiatry since the 1950s. The result was, by scientific publication standards, unusually clear. Comparable efficacy between the plant extract and the synthetic drug, with a significantly better adverse effect profile in the saffron-treated group. And then came King's College London. King's College is one of the world's most respected research centers in neuroscience and psychiatry. When a team from the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at that institution decided to delve into the investigation of a medicinal plant, the academic world took notice. The group, led by Dr. Samantha Byatt and colleagues, working with data from several trials, published a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses between 2012 and 2018 on the effects of saffron on mood disorders. Their conclusions, summarized with the careful language used in scientific literature, amounted to saying, "This works." Specifically, meta-analyses from King's College, analyzing data from trials with several hundred participants, found that standardized saffron extract, at doses of between 15 and 30 milligrams daily, produced improvements in depressive symptoms comparable to those obtained with fluoxetine and imipramine in patients with mild to moderate depression. The phrase, comparable to fluoxetine, is, in the context of the pharmaceutical industry, worth billions. Fluoxetine is the most prescribed antidepressant in the history of modern psychiatry. That a flower documented on stone walls for 3,500 years produces comparable effects is not mere poetry. It is a clinical finding with economic and health implications that should have triggered a wave of research and public interest. It didn't. At least, not immediately. Why exactly was that comparison to fluoxetine both its strength and its handicap in the market? We'll see in a moment. First, we need to understand what saffron does inside the human brain, because that explanation is what makes this whole story of Minoan frescoes and medieval German courts directly relevant to anyone reading this. The stigmas of Crocus sativus contain, in their chemical composition, 3 groups of compounds that researchers have identified as primarily responsible for their physiological effects. The first is crocin, the family of carotenoid glycosides that gives saffron its intense red color and, when dissolved in water or any aqueous medium, produces its characteristic orange-yellow hue. The second is saffronol, a volatile compound responsible for the spice's distinctive aroma, that scent that any cook who has opened a box of genuine saffron immediately recognizes, slightly metallic, floral, and somewhat medicinal. The third is picrocrocin, the glycoside that generates saffron's bitter taste when chewed or added to broth. These 3 compounds act on the central nervous system through mechanisms that molecular neuroscience is still mapping in detail, but whose general outlines are already quite clear. Crocin and saffronol inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine at neuronal synapses, which is precisely the mechanism by which most modern antidepressants work. But in addition, and this is what makes saffron an object of research in neurology and not just psychiatry, crocin has a property that no commonly used synthetic antidepressant shares. It acts as an inhibitor of the aggregation of beta-amyloid plaques. Beta-amyloid plaques are the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. They are accumulations of protein fragments that deposit in brain tissue, interfere with synaptic transmission, generate neuronal inflammation, and are directly related to the progressive cognitive decline that characterizes this disease. The exact mechanism by which crocin inhibits this aggregation is being actively investigated, but the results of studies in cell and animal models published in the last decade are consistent. Crocin reduces beta-amyloid accumulation, reduces markers of oxidative stress in brain tissue, and, in some rodent studies, improves performance on memory and learning tests. A clinical trial published in the Journal of Clinical Pharmacy and Therapeutics in 2016, conducted by Iranian researchers in collaboration with European universities, examined the effects of saffron extract on 54 patients diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, the precursor to Alzheimer's disease, over a 16-week period. The group treated with saffron showed statistically significant improvements on cognitive assessment scales compared to the placebo group. It was a small study, as its authors clearly stated, but it was a result that pointed in a certain direction. Since that study, the pace of publications on saffron and cognitive decline has accelerated considerably. A group of researchers from Swinburne University in Australia published a double-blind trial in 2019 in the journal Psychopharmacology, using saffron extract in healthy older adults, which showed improvements in cognitive processing speed and working memory. Researchers from Mashhad University in Iran have published a series of studies since 2015 on the neuroprotective effects of crocin in brain aging models, which have been cited in top-quartile neuroscience journals. And the King's College group mentioned earlier has published reviews on the use of saffron for anxiety, depression, and cognition, which have been reprinted in the specialized medical press in several European countries. All of this does not make saffron a cure for Alzheimer's. It would be irresponsible to say so, and it would be false. Large-scale clinical trials, with thousands of participants, several years of follow-up, and the rigorous methodological controls required by evidence-based medicine to approve a preventative treatment for a neurodegenerative disease have not yet been conducted. They are expensive, they are slow, and, here's the key point, no pharmaceutical company that cannot patent the active ingredient at the end of the process will fund them. Because Crocus sativus, like any plant that has been cultivated for thousands of years on 3 continents, is impossible to patent in its natural form. What can be patented are standardized extracts with specific concentrations of crocin or saffronal, using protected extraction processes. That is exactly what some companies in the dietary supplement sector have begun to do in the last 10 years in Europe and the United States. But saffron in its natural form, the red thread you buy at the market, the powder your grandmother used to add to her rice pudding, is not in the hands of any corporation. It is in the hands of anyone who wants to cultivate it. If these stories grab you, subscribe to the channel. The next one is at least as old and just as unsettling today. Let's get back to practical matters, because this story doesn't end in a London laboratory. It ends, if it ever does, in your home. Manchego saffron, with its protected designation of origin, PDO status, which boasts the strictest regulations in the world regarding minimum crocin, saffronol, and picrocrocin content, is currently produced in an area of La Mancha encompassing parts of the provinces of Albacete, Ciudad Real, Cuenca, and Toledo. Its production is minuscule. The most recent estimates suggest between 1 and 2 tons annually for the total certified production. This makes it one of the rarest food products in Europe, and also one of the most frequently counterfeited, in what could be an ironic return to the problem that the Nuremberg Saffron Festival attempted to solve with bonfires in the 15th century. Studies on saffron adulteration in the global market, published by research groups from the University of Murcia and the University of Castilla-La Mancha, show that between 40 and 60% of the saffron sold in international markets under generic names is adulterated to some degree, with safflower, with turmeric mixed with artificial colorings, with parts of the plant other than the stigmas, or with stigmas from other crocus species. The consumer who buys a shiny box in a supermarket for €3 is, in many cases, not buying what they think they are buying. If you want saffron with guaranteed authenticity and active content, these are your options. Look for the Protected Designation of Origin (PDO) seal for La Mancha saffron, which guarantees that the product has passed the analytical controls of the Regulatory Council, or buy directly from cooperatives of producers in La Mancha, who in recent years have developed online direct sales channels that allow access to the product without intermediaries. In Mexico, Argentina, and the rest of the Spanish-speaking world, authentic La Mancha saffron arrives through importers specializing in Iberian products. The price is higher than that of generic saffron of Iranian or Indian origin, but it is the only way to guarantee that you are buying what you think you are buying. As for cultivation, Crocus sativus can be grown in areas with cold winters and dry summers. It thrives in the Mexican highlands, in Hidalgo, Tlaxcala, and the highlands of the state of Mexico, in Argentine and Chilean Patagonia, in central Chile, in the high valleys of Colombia and Peru, and in virtually any region of Spain with a continental climate. It needs well-drained, slightly alkaline soil and does not tolerate waterlogging. The corms, the saffron bulbs, are planted in August or September, flower in October or November depending on the altitude and climate, and then go dormant until the following year. Once established, the planting can last for several years before needing to be renewed. For domestic and medicinal use, a small plot of 10 square meters can produce enough flowers to supply a family for the entire season. Traditional dosages, as described in both classical Arabic literature and pre-modern European medical treatises, range from 1 to 2 grams of dried stigmas per day for medicinal use, typically dissolved in hot water or milk. Modern clinical studies demonstrating mood-enhancing effects have used standardized extracts of between 15 and 30 milligrams of dry extract per day, roughly equivalent to 100 to 200 milligrams of dried stigmas. Typical culinary amounts, a pinch for rice, half a gram for paella, are well below therapeutic thresholds and completely safe. The contraindications that must be clearly stated are as follows. Saffron at high doses, above 5 grams of dried stigmas daily, can be toxic, producing nausea, vomiting, bleeding, and, at very high doses, effects on the central nervous system that, in documented extreme cases, have been severe. It is contraindicated during pregnancy because, at medicinal doses, it can have uterotonic effects that increase the risk of miscarriage. People taking synthetic antidepressant medication should consult their doctor before adding saffron supplements due to the possibility of interactions with neurotransmitter systems. And people with allergies to plants of the Iridaceae family should exercise caution. Within these limits, saffron is one of the best documented medicinal foods in history and one of the best tolerated by modern medicine in terms of safety. Centuries of empirical use and recent clinical trials point in the same direction. This plant does something real in the human brain. It's not magic. It's biochemistry that we've been harnessing for thousands of years without knowing exactly how it worked. In the markets of Spanish-speaking cities, saffron is ubiquitous. From Barcelona's Boqueria market, where Catalan spice vendors have been offering strands of Manchego saffron alongside other Mediterranean spices for generations, to the herbalists of Seville and Granada, where saffron is still sold as a medicinal plant, steeped in tradition since the Andalusian period. In Mexico, the Sonora market in Mexico City features stalls where saffron sits alongside mullein, epazote, and dozens of other medicinal plants, a blend of indigenous and European herbalism that represents the great medical synthesis of the vice-regal capital. In Lima, the Surquillo market has spice vendors who import Iranian saffron, although demand is growing slowly as new-generation Peruvian chefs rediscover ingredients that were once commonplace in colonial cookbooks. In Buenos Aires, Mediterranean product stores in the Palermo neighborhood sell Spanish saffron at prices that reflect the cost of importation, but also the quality of the product. Subscribe to this channel. Every week we open a different chapter of nature's archives, one of those chapters that someone, at some point, preferred to keep closed. What has stayed with me most, after tracing this history from the Minoan wall to the neurology lab, is a specific image. In 1552, when the friars of the Santiago Tlatelolco convent in Mexico City, along with the indigenous physician Martín de la Cruz and the translator Juan Badiano, compiled what we know today as the Cruz-Badiano Codex, the first treatise on herbal medicine in the Americas, written in Nahuatl and translated into Latin, They included references to medicinal plants for chest and spirit ailments that the Franciscan monks had learned from the Tichital, the Mexica healers. In that same century, in the convents of La Mancha, the nuns preparing their herbal teas and ointments added saffron to the preparations for the same conditions. In Tabriz, the Persian physicians who inherited Avicenna's tradition used the same Crocus sativus for the same symptoms. In the monasteries of Tibet, Buddhist monks incorporated it into their meditations and medicines. 4 civilizations, 4 religious traditions, 4 continents, the same knowledge. No possible exchange between them. It's not by chance, it's observation. The same observation that today, with reagents, spectrometers, and clinical trial databases, we are now confirming. There are things that humanity knows before it knows that it knows them.